Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. I do want to just give one more quick second for everybody just to get in following the go-to link. Okay, let's go ahead and dive in, get started. So welcome, everyone. I'm so glad that you joined. We're here today to talk about how leaders are tackling Scope 1 and 2 emissions, but more importantly, how they're proving it. So my name is Sarah Risley. I'm the Certification Officer at Green Circle Certified, and I'm so glad that you joined us. And I know it's a super busy time of year for all of us, and so, we're going to spend the next hour or so really spending some time diving into verification and learning a lot about what is evolving and rapidly changing about the carbon landscape. Before we get started, there's always the housekeeping items. So I did want to let everyone know the session is being recorded, and we will give you access to that link as a registrant within the next day or so. There will be time for Q&A at the end, so if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat in the QA box at any time, and then we'll get to those at the end, and we'll get through as many as we can during that time. And then the last housekeeping item, we do have some polls today to help, kind of stay engaged and work through the content together. And so if you see that poll, it'll pop up. You'll be able to, in your go-to meeting link, you'll be able to click on answers and answer the polls that way. So, as I said, I'm the certification officer at Green Circle, and I oversee all of our accredited certification programs and lead the development of new services. And so I'm very excited to talk about Green Circle's greenhouse gas verification service today. My job really centers around the rigor, impartiality, transparency, but most importantly for Green Circle, our certifications are there to help make sure that organizations have the data and the claims that they can stand behind. So whether it's for regulatory reporting, your customer requirements, or even just your own internal decision making or your sustainability goals, that's really where Green Circle is here to help. And my job is really to help make sure you can leverage that as best as you can. So we are a third-party certification body. We have been in business since 2009, and our role is really to provide that independent validation of sustainability claims. We are very good about making sure that all of our services, all of our evaluations, our audits, our requirements, that number one, they're auditable, they're repeatable, but more importantly, that they're backed with data-driven and science-based methods. And so you'll often see a lot of Green Circle certifications, that are leaning on the existing frameworks and how to leverage those for your sustainability claims. And so everything that we verify, whether it's recycled content, waste diversion, energy practices, and now GHG emissions, follows that structured and very impartial process. So talking a little bit about our agenda for today. So we'll start off by really looking at what's the carbon reporting landscape look like? What are the different scenarios that you might encounter as an organization, and really how to leverage verification for those reasons. We'll go into some of those market external pressures that are really driving the need for verification. Talk a little bit about why. What's the business value? How do you get your return on investment if you do decide to get your GHG statement and your emissions reporting independently verified? Use some real world examples and studies on how folks have used verifications in different scenarios for their business needs. And then finally, really looking at, how is Green Circle approaching this, and, our recommendations for, what would be good next steps if you're really considering verification as a business tool. So before we dive in, I wanted to start off with our poll question. So to get us kind of thinking about the sense of what kind of pressures you're facing, you know, as an organization. And so the first poll question is really centered around what external pressures you might be influencing your organization's reporting. So are you worried about regulatory? Do you have voluntary frameworks that you support, or, you know, are there other reasons like your own ESG or sustainability targets? And I will just go back to my other screen. So interestingly enough, I'm like seeing the results as they're coming in, you guys. So voluntary reporting is our highest. So definitely through, and we'll talk a little bit about CDP and what the Carbon Disclosure Project does and how it helps businesses. And so this is actually a really good balance of what we're seeing as well, where there's starting to emerge those regulatory reporting, but that, you know, a lot of the requirements for GHG are, you know, centered around your stakeholders, whether it's investors, your own, you know, sales opportunities with retailers, or your customers that are requiring it. And so it's a great spread, and so you'll see as we kind of continue through the slides why I'm saying that, because really for us, we're seeing that transition. So the pressure is definitely on. Credible emissions data, you know, is really something that is shifting from a voluntary nice to have to a mandatory disclosure. And that mandatory disclosure isn't just that you disclose, but there are requirements around the types of frameworks that you use so that there's consistency. If company A is, you know, providing their GHG emissions, and, you know, looking then at company B, how do we keep that consistent? And so those assurance requirements and some of the information that I'll share today really does help to make that mandatory disclosure consistent across organizations and easy to understand from a reporting perspective. And so because of these shifts, you know, we're really seeing, you know, companies are no longer asking, should we report, but how do we prove it? So if we're going to put some data out there, we're going to put it in a report, or we're going to put it on our website, you know, what level of assurance or proof is really necessary to make that a credible, viable information that you're sharing very publicly. So what does that look like? So when we're talking to companies about why they want to, you know, verify their emissions, the reasons usually fall into one of 5 places, one of 5 categories. The first is just that growing market demand. You know, that they really are starting to implement those frameworks. So it's not just that you can send your sustainability data to maybe your vendor, your procurement, or obtaining that from your supply chain. You can't do that in a spreadsheet anymore. You know, a lot of those stakeholders and through those processes are really looking for proof. They want to know not only that you have accurate GHG emissions, but also that you're evaluating it in a consistent way. The second reason that we're seeing kind of this drive towards verified emissions is really about benefiting you as a business. So companies are realizing that it's directly tied to their revenue. So, you know, if you're going in to prospect or to submit RFPs, there are oftentimes, you know, procurement requirements for you to have GHG emissions to submit with those business opportunities. And so it's not, again, not a nice to have, it's becoming your kind of ticket to the table, right? So that you can, you know, provide that business and win and really help continue your growth. The third example is really about your brand. So having that competitive advantage, that differentiation in the market, you know, when you're compared to a competitor who's making a much bolder climate claim, but they don't have it verified or don't have evidence to really support the credibility of that, you know, that's where verification can help either level the playing field or even create an advantage where your competitors may not be verified. And so because it's really there to prove, you're not just saying the right things, maybe like your competitor is, you're really backing them up with the right type of verification and credibility. The fourth example is, and I'm splitting this out from revenue generation and business growth because corporate and government contracts tend to be a very niche aspect of business strategy, but very, very important. So if you're, trying to submit, especially for a government contract under an RFP, there will be continued focus on writing verification directly into that procurement criteria. So whether you're, really trying to get in with a retailer like Walmart or Amazon, or you're, really looking to get, build a building for, under a government agency. So if you want to keep and win those contracts, the verification of that emissions data is quickly becoming part of that process. And then the last is positioning for future climate regulations. So I will go through this in a lot more detail in the next slide, but you should, if you're not, be watching those, especially in the US, those state level laws and regulations that are currently being discussed. Things like California in 2026 will start to require you to report GHG emissions if you're doing business there. And so it's not a future requirement. It is really starting to come to fruition, and it's here. And so, wanting to be ready, be prepared to know that you already have that data. It's already been verified so that you're not scrambling at the last minute, taking up all your team's time, and having an accurate, defendable accounting system. So no matter which category kind of resonated with you, and depending on what you do for your business and what your business needs are, the pressure is still there. And the story is the same. Verification becomes a core business essential and not just a technical exercise or a nice to have to show support for your ESG goals. And so the organizations and companies that really embrace it early are not only the ones that benefit from all of these categories in terms of your revenue growth or your competitive advantage, but they're also the ones that are seen as leaders and shaping the narrative for this as we move, forward, and it becomes a bigger conversation. So I wanted to take a few minutes just to give you some awareness on the external pressures. And so there's kind of three buckets that really are accelerating quickly, and we've seen a lot of shift and move towards verified emissions under these categories. And they really do converge on one expectation, which is that it's credible, it's verifiable, but most importantly, it's comparable. So we're using the same frameworks, so company A can be compared to company B. And so the three buckets are regulators, investors, and customers. And so let's start with regulators, because that is a huge kind of trending hot button topic. And I have some good updates that I actually just from yesterday to share from California. And so if we start to look at the US state level regulations, what's happening is, when we don't have federal regulations at the federal level, the states then start to create their own. And so that's really the process that we're seeing happening today. California is the first state to have passed legislation that requires you to, if you are doing business in California and you have annual revenue over $1 billion, you have to start disclosing your GHG emissions to them. And hot off the presses, we had a CARB workshop yesterday where they're going through this framework. So CARB is the California Air Resources Board. It's the agency that's responsible for implementing the California law under SB 253. And so they've been working throughout this whole year to develop the framework for the implementation in 2026. And so in this regulation, it does require you to have limited assurance in order to be able to use your GHG emissions for reporting to them. Now, based on the workshop they had yesterday, they are proposing to allow some flexibility in 2026 as it's the first year that they're requiring the reporting. And so you will not have to have verified emissions data for 2026, but it is planned that that requirement will be in place for 2027. And so it's a good time to start thinking about how do you prepare? How do you, if you're a part of, those businesses that have annual revenue over $1 billion and are going to be required to disclose your emissions. Similarly, we're seeing A number of other states follow suit behind California and developing their own regulations, and a lot of them are actually mirroring SB 253 and in a lot of ways for their requirements. So New Jersey and Illinois, you know, there's quite a few that have those bills pending. They haven't been approved or passed yet, but you know, something definitely to keep an eye on, and know that California usually is the leader, and the other states will follow behind. Similarly, if we're looking at regulations and you start to think about if you export to Europe, so we all know, if you've been in the sustainability space for any period of time, Europe definitely has more rigorous regulations and frameworks around sustainability compliance. And so their mandatory reporting it falls under CSRD. And so it's the EU's essentially comprehensive sustainability disclosure. And so it requires companies that are you know, in the EU to report standardized, detailed ESG information, which does include your GHG emissions. And so under CSRD, you can start with limited assurance as your initial reporting, and then you have to move and transition towards reasonable assurance. And so I'll get to that in a little bit more detail so I can really explain what that limited versus reasonable assurance is under the verification. But it's really starting to become you know, an important thing, especially for those of you that are doing business in Europe. Similarly, for CBAM, which is the carbon border accounting measure or mechanism, that's the tariff. So if you import into Europe, this regulation requires you to measure, report, and then starting in 2026, you are going to have essentially a tax on, depending on the carbon that's in your products that you sell there. And so we're in the transitional phase right now, but in 2026, those emissions do have to be independently verified. And they are using the most rigorous form of verification, requiring reasonable assurance. And so, you know, because those CBAM requirements carry real financial value, that is really important for you to make sure that your emissions are correct, that you're evaluating them correctly. And so the regulators really driving those importance of verification to help you make sure not only they're credible and defendable, but that they're comparable for all of the different companies that are reporting out under that regulation for the fees. And so, you know, for the second, so when we're looking at regulators, very always closely tied are the global frameworks. And so, you know, I have this under the category of investors because a lot of these global frameworks, unlike the regulations, are really used to help make business decisions. So the CDP is the Carbon Disclosure Project. It's the world's biggest environmental disclosure system. And, you know, they are a voluntary program, but one that really matters from a voluntary perspective. So they have 700 investors that represent over $100 trillion in assets that use the Climate Disclosure Project and the framework and the scoring to really help them make those decisions on the financial investments. And so it is then often, because of this, required by customers, especially those larger retailers or brands, to really have a strong score, that they have verified emissions, and, you know, using that as a way to, with their procurement criteria, to vet their vendors and suppliers. And so what we're seeing then through the financial frameworks like ISSB, which is, you know, the second, this is the second of TCFD. So these are frameworks that, you know, are really there to help understand the financial risk from a climate risk perspective. And so again, you know, having the most up-to-date, accurate, defendable data is going to help you be successful in using these frameworks for your business. And then the last is your customers. So think of all those retailers out there that are trying to vet products to go on their shelf or to go in their e-commerce site. A lot of retailers are pushing suppliers harder than even the regulations or the global frameworks are, to really, again, meet customer demands, but also to, you know, show that they're taking responsibility in the types of products that they put on their shelves. And so you can kind of see from this slide, there's a varying level of external pressures and significant reasons why GHG emissions verification is really important. And so if you start to think about these shifts, start to see, okay, things are being requested more, we're developing these frameworks, we've had a lot of maturity in how we're looking at this. You can start to see, though, that the transition from viewing verification as a cost really starts to be recognized more as a strategic advantage. And so if you don't have verification, you know, there's some implications to that. So like your data is self-reported, and, you know, that's a very apparent, when you don't have the verification, that's a very apparent thing to your stakeholders. That does bring in a couple of issues. One is that, you know, there may be errors. So you have this risk of that you're misstating your emissions, or that, you know, they're not accurate, which can then lead to that limited investor trust. You're not ready for the reporting requirements when those regulations start to come into play, and so you're very reactive. With limited assurance, you have an independent validation of that data. So you have a really high data confidence, you know you're meeting the frameworks, you know that with verification, you know, you're ready for disclosure, whether it's a regulation or a voluntary framework like CDP. And so it really helps to give you that better market position, and so that you're not scrambling at the last minute to find the data that you need and putting all of that pressure on your teams. And so it really does help organizations future-proof their reporting, but also then, as you can see from, you know, just looking at the landscape, there are lots of other reasons besides regulations where this is really important. There's a second arm, though, that I wanted to talk a little bit about, which for Green Circle is the most important. So our mission is really to, you know, accelerate market transformation. You know, having a lot of awareness around measures and things that can be put in place by organizations that will have a really positive impact on the environment and climate change. And so when looking at this, the way that Green Circle looks at it is really to think about it from this perspective of a continuous improvement loop. So if we look at this circle on the left of the slide, it starts with assess. That's at the top of the circle. And so we're, you know, when you're looking at starting to understand your emissions and what your organization is doing, it's really important to first understand, what are my boundaries? Where are my sources of emissions? What challenges maybe do I have in tracking that or in evaluating that appropriately to where the facility is located? And so going through this exercise to really bring that into some framework and some strategy to really understand what are my boundaries and how am I going to evaluate this. Then based on that assessment, you can gather data and you can collect it and you can organize it and you can develop your accounting system so that you're routinely getting that data from the places you need it. And then comes verification and assurance. So, you know, you've assessed, you've collected your data, you've organized it. Now you're going to, you know, make sure with an independent review that that is accurate and that you haven't missed anything, or that there's not any improvements that need to be made for compliance to the requirements that exist today. And so that's really where assurance is helpful, because it does not just provide you with the statement that says, yes, your GHG emissions is materially correct, but it also gives you a process to go through to evaluate how, you know, what gaps you might have, what issues you have that may have a risk for you on, you know, misstating your GHG emissions. And so that's where the most important part of the circle comes in, which is improve. So not only does verification give you the statement that you need and the credible, defendable data, but the process also allows us to go through and give you very insightful information on things that you could do better, things that need to change in order to be compliant with the framework. And so it gives you a lot of information, not only to make sure your GHG emissions reporting is correct, but more importantly, it gives you data to make business decisions. to reduce your risk, and to be able to plan for improvements. So I'm sure a lot of you have very specific ESG targets, and emissions is usually one of the biggest ones that we're trying to reduce over time, whether you have a 2030, 2035, 2050 goal. And so this information really does help give you some insights into, okay, I'm going to spend this much in capital on, this improvement initiative at my facility. What's the impact, and how can we measure that so that we know that we're spending that money responsibly? And so this continuous improvement cycle is a big piece of what is the value and why organizations really use verification as a way not only to have their data reviewed, but also to get the details and the insights from subject matter experts that know the frameworks in and out. And so organizations often tell us that the verification is the first time that they've had clarity over their quality gaps or inconsistencies or even understanding of the framework. And so, big question, what is GHG verification? And so for GHG verification under the ISO framework, so ISO has standards 14064 series. -3 is where you can see it requires and details the process for a systematic, independent evaluation of your data. And the goal with 14064-3 is to determine and verify your greenhouse gas statement and emissions. We want to make sure that it's complete, it's consistent and accurate, that it's transparent. So if there are any specific scope or specific exceptions that you include, that does get included in the evaluation and the report to make sure that it's transparent as possible. And then most importantly, that there are no errors or any issues with your emissions for reporting. The scope of the ISO framework is really quite broad. You can do a facility, you can do a portfolio, you can do a corporate inventory where you're consolidating everything under one reporting mechanism. And really the frameworks are there to make sure that when you're using each of those scenarios, that again, it's comparable and we're consistent in how we're reporting. And so one kind of caveat for GHG verification that I do like to talk to folks about is just that, it is very limited to your emissions. So for example, verification is not something you would use to support your carbon neutrality or, a full product carbon footprint. That's really outside of the scope and requires additional evaluation and work. And so your GHG emissions under the ISO 14064 framework is, very specific to your emissions. And so our Green Circle's GHG verification service is specific to scope 1 and scope 2. And I'll talk a little bit next about the different assurance levels, but ours is really putting a lot on limited assurance. So we want that to be our scope. One of the reasons we're not including scope 3 right now is just simply because the market's not ready, you guys. So if you're thinking about, you should, if you're not, thinking about how you want to start scope 3 and really evaluating your suppliers and the downstream contributions to your emissions, that is something that folks are really starting to drive, but we haven't reached the maturity yet to include that in the verification. It can be included when we're looking, especially if you're looking at Europe, because they're much further ahead of where US is. But for Green Circle's GHG verification, our standard service is scope 1, scope 2 under limited assurance. And what you get from our verification is that verification statement. And so this is really where deciding what type of verification you want becomes important. And so I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about this topic because it is very misunderstood. So there are 2 levels of assurance in the GHG frameworks. One is limited assurance, which is our lower level of confidence. It really focuses on analytical procedures and inquiries and understanding to develop the statement versus reasonable assurance, Reasonable assurance provides a higher level of confidence, but in order to do that, it does require a much more extensive audit and verification for, looking at evidence and really having a full stop, opinion that it is 100% accurate. And so, that really helps to define how it will work for you as a business and what you might need depending on your business needs. So the limited assurance, the type of conclusion that comes out of those verifications is what's called a negative form. So the wording will say something like, nothing came to our attention. So it means, hey, what we looked at, we didn't see anything. But it doesn't go to that next level that reasonable assurance does, which is a positive conclusion that, hey, in our opinion, it's fairly stated. So we've looked at everything. We, have done that deep dive. This distinction between the limited and reasonable is really important because you need to understand what you're going to use it for. So limited assurance, which is the lower level of confidence, is used and required in state regulations like SB 253 and voluntary disclosures like the CDP. Where you need that higher level of confidence and specificity in your statement would be when you're using it for specific regulations, like in Europe. So CSRD requires reasonable assurance over time, or if you're using it for, financial decisions or financial reporting. So that investor grade ESG reporting that you may be required depending on your business. And so most companies start with limited assurance to identify gaps, move towards continuously improving, looking at their frameworks, understanding how they're collecting data. And then once they have some more confidence in their carbon accounting systems, they would move towards that more complete assurance under reasonable. And so I do want to pause here where our next section is really just giving you some examples of how businesses are leveraging that verification in these different aspects for voluntary and regulatory reporting. And so I wanted you guys to take just a minute, a few seconds to think, where is your organization, planning? Where do you, see yourself needing for reporting next year? And so is it, you need limited assurance or reasonable, or you're still evaluating, you're not sure. It's why you're here, to learn a little bit more about what verification is and how it's important, or you're just starting your journey and you're really, not planning verification yet. And so what, it does help to make sure that why you're going to use your verification, to really understand what level of assurance, but more importantly, how ready are you? So, if you are very early in your GHG emissions process and how you're tracking and your data and accounting, then, don't start with reasonable assurance. There's almost always going to be, improvements and things you need to make where limited assurance would be a better fit for you as you work to improve and, become more mature in your system. And so majority of folks on the call today are not sure, they're still evaluating. And so that's great. It really is something to kind of look at in two ways, where you're going to use your verification, what you need it for, and then where are you at in your overall confidence with your system and the process that you have for tracking and gathering that data. And so one of the ways that we can use others is by evaluating, kind of understanding case studies and examples of how others in the industry have used their verification for their business needs. And so I have 3 examples today that I wanted to go through with you guys, just to give a flavor of, how not only are they receiving their verification, but how they use that to continuously improve. And how they use that to set themselves up for success in the different areas that they, were required for their organization. So the first example is about being ready for regulations. And so California's carbon accountability reporting requirements. And so we have a mid-sized manufacturer. They have 2 facilities in California where they know SB 253 is going to be required for them. And so SB 253 as a regulation does require assured, so limited assurance on their verification. And so they, needed to obtain that verification. However, during the process, while they were, getting their verification, it was found that they had some errors. They had some inconsistencies. Their metering intervals, how they were normalizing between facilities. So one facility was using their production output, the other was using their operating hours. And so those inconsistencies have a material impact to what you're submitting as your GHG emissions. And so through the verification process, they were able to identify those issues, work to fix them, incorporate updated procedures on how they were evaluating using the same factors, for example, between facilities. So there's consistency and having a unified data management system across both sites. And so then what they saw was not only, did they achieve their verification, but they did it well before they knew they needed it for California. And so they're ready. They have their early assurance. And so they have benefited in both ways from verification, where they're ready for their regulation and the reporting, can be confident about the transparency, but they were also able to really identify big gaps and continuously improve those in order to really feel confident about their system. So the second example that I have is a voluntary framework example. So, there's a global CPG firm, uses the CDP voluntary framework as a lever for them from a business operations and procurement aspect. And so they know that they need to have a good score in order to win business, in order to be transparent about their sustainability claims and their journey. And so they realized, hey, we can significantly improve our overall carbon disclosure project score, so the climate change score that's awarded under this framework, if we get our emissions verified. So you can get a leadership level A from the CDP if you have not only public disclosure of your emissions, but a third-party verification that covers at least 70% of your Scope 1, Scope 2 emissions. And so limited assurance under the ISO framework is a verification that the CDP recognizes. So with that verification, then they were able to improve their overall score for the CDP. So they have higher data confidence. They can use that carbon disclosure project scoring in their business needs, but also, really have a strong message that aligns not only with publicly disclosing your GHG emissions, but pairing that with your CDP score. And so here's just a quick reference. If you are in a management level, under level B, for example, you can use your verification to get the 1 to 2 points that you need to move into the leadership level under A for the climate disclosure project scoring threshold. And so this is a really important tool if you're not using it and you have you have your CDP submissions and things you're going to be working on. This is a really helpful tool in order to quickly move up through that transition, in your scoring from a B to an A, as an example. The last one, let's move to Europe. So we have a North American manufacturer. They're exporting to the European Union. The carbon adjustment, or the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is CBAM, is what they were really trying to understand, what their impacts were going to be. And so they completed limited assurance verification to really help validate their product level carbon footprint, which is really focused on Scope 1, Scope 2 emissions. And this is what the CBAM requirements are using then to evaluate how much you need to pay. So the verification confirmed, their methodologies were aligned with the frameworks that were required, and it really helped give them the data that they needed in order to do those reporting under CBAM. So they were ahead of the requirements. So the compliance deadline for CBAM in the EU is 2026. And so in this case, the company was able to have no disruption, that they're ready so they can ensure their business continuity with their partners in the EU, and reducing the overall delays that might happen at the border, but more importantly, kind of the fees, the tariffs that are associated with those products. And so just even beyond compliance, it becomes a differentiator for this North American manufacturer because they are already ready. And so when they're talking to their EU partners or new customers where they're trying to bring on board, it is something, you know, that they'll disclose and talk about that will help them differentiate from their competition. So really what we're seeing with those examples, with kind of doing that deep dive into what the landscape is for how verification, you know, supports you as an overall business, it's very clear. One, verification can help you support multiple frameworks. So one of the biggest values of especially ISO 14064 is that, you know, it can be used and is recognized by a number of regulations, voluntary frameworks, and things that will have, you know, each business will have to comply to or will want to as part of your business strategy. So having one verified, you know, GHG inventory really lets you report consistently and you're not redoing the work. And so that framework really helps to then support compliance depending on no matter where you are reporting. And so I've got our last poll for our session, you guys. So before we dive in to just understanding a little bit more about how Green Circle approaches verification, I wanted to kind of circle back and based on the information, you know, that we've kind of talked about and navigated through, like changes in landscape and that type of thing, you know, what is your primary motivation? What's keeping you, you know, up at night where you know you need to get your emissions verified? Whether it's compliance, it's investor expectations, data confidence, reducing your risk, you know, avoiding your misreporting, trying to kind of look at and understand that for your business can be very helpful, because not only then are you able to justify, you know, the benefits of verification, but also have a very clear idea of how far you want to go. Do you want to go all the way to the top and get reasonable assurance, or is limited assurance, you know, a better fit? And so like seeing the results come in, the biggest one is definitely customer retailer requirements, and then data confidence and internal improvements, reducing risk. So it is really something I think that we'll start to see even more of a shift on, especially from a compliance perspective, as we start to see some of the regulations in the US at the state level start to be implemented and make that a requirement. It's a great great way to think about it. And so with that, I will then lead into, okay, how does Green Circle view this? So for us, I will say I have a couple of recommendations, you guys. First is, if you are thinking about verification, it really is for companies that are tracking and measuring their emissions. So things like your office energy use, fuel consumption, facility level, operational, specific sources, depending on what you do and how you do it. So if you're managing and moderating your operational emissions, you know, you're going to be a good fit for limited assurance verification. In order to obtain that verification, you do have to provide data. So there is some, you know, time and data investments that you'll have to make, and, you know, for your verifier to follow the framework and to, you know, provide an accurate verification. Those data requirements include, you know, looking at 12 months. So that's the time period for the ISO framework. We're going to look at full 12 months, whether it's a calendar year or whether you want to use your, you know, fiscal year if it's offset like June to June. But we really need to see a full 12 months of your emissions data. Also then, same time period, we're going to look for production data. So not only do we want to understand what you're consuming, but how much of that is then supporting the products that you're selling. And then we have some very specific requirements on supporting documentation. So having at least 3 months of your utility bills or some other documentation that we can use to verify those numbers that you're providing as your emissions. And then any supporting documentation, especially around like renewable energy credits, or contracts that you have where you're very specific about how you're tracking that energy that you're receiving. And so we will look for not only that you have purchased those RECs, but they're also retired and that you're tracking them appropriately. Additionally, there are some specific data requests that really are dependent on where your facility is located, what you're making, what other types of sources may be included, depending on your operations. And so I will take a minute here just to note that limited assurance it's not automatically awarded. So the findings do have to support the evidence in order for you to receive a verification statement. If there are data or gaps or things that you can't resolve in order to receive the verification, then we will still issue a statement, but it will be qualified or an adverse opinion. And the reason I'm calling this out is this is one of the reasons why GHG verification stays so credible, because you will not receive a verification statement unless you meet the criteria. And so when looking at this, what we're really seeing is that for most companies, limited assurance in following this process really does provide the right level of confidence without overtaxing you or your organization, your team on the data requirements. And so the process, what are the steps? Really high overview, Green Circle does verify under the ISO framework 14064. So 14064-3 has kind of 4 critical steps that must be followed in order to provide the verification statement. So the first is we're going to do a strategic analysis. So this is very similar to the assess in our continuous improvement model. So you're going to start by defining what's the scope. What's included, what are we excluding, how are we communicating those exclusions, where is it, the location, how you're incorporating some of those emission factors and other things that are incorporated. What this step really does is it helps to make sure that everyone's aligned and clear on how you are going to evaluate. So what part of your operations and how you're considering that from an analytical perspective. Once you have that defined, then we will do a risk assessment. So this step really is ISO's gut check. So we're looking at, okay, this is the boundary and the scope and the objectives. Where could there be risks? So inherent risks maybe to the data, control, how you're managing it, how you're tracking it, any detection or anomalies that come in and how you're handling those. And so we're really, under the risk assessment review, we're really just looking for the chance that there could be errors that might go unnoticed. And so that's why I call it a gut check. So we're taking everything that you're submitting and just taking a step back and saying, okay, does this make sense? Where could there be issues that we should, look at further and make sure they're mitigated? And so then the step for risk assessment really then helps us, hone in maybe on specific areas where we want to see a little bit more documentation or, a little bit more explanation or robust justifications from you on, how you're using that for your greenhouse gas emissions calculation. The third step is doing the review. So we'll actually take the data and the evidence that you submit and do the full review. So not only are we looking at the data that you're submitting, but we're also then evaluating that under the methodologies for 14064 and making sure that everything is calculated correctly. Any exceptions or notes that we need to be transparent about are included. And really completing, the work that needs to be there to say number 4, which is we have, given you your verification statement and you've achieved limited assurance. So really quickly for this, I just wanted to give kind of an example of the type of information that's included in a statement. So this is the final deliverable that you would receive for GHG, which is your verification statement. It outlines the scope that we review, the procedures we perform, and most importantly, it has that conclusion, which includes the verification statement. So, your emissions are clearly summarized. You get a signature and a date so that you can use that to say, yes, this is the third-party verifier that completed this work. And it's really the document that you're going to use to show your verification and defend it. And so this is really not only important for us to have as a deliverable, but it's also something that we recommend you do every year. So the final assurance statement that you get it doesn't expire, and it is an attestation that your emissions, are materially correct and stated fairly. However, it is only for the time period that are evaluated. And so most clients do maintain this every year. They will continue to obtain verification for a couple of reasons. One, so they have it to use for their business needs like CDP or regulatory reporting. The second, though, is those year-over-year comparisons. So if you have any goals or want to target goals to reduce your emissions over time, this is a really great way to have the data so you can see those comparisons year over year in a consistent way. Do that. So I hope that you learned something for sure. And, we've got a few minutes, to really open it up for a discussion, try to answer some questions that you guys have. And really for me, the core piece of verification is that it's not a nice to have. It's definitely becoming essential for you as a business in all of the ways that we talked about today. But more importantly, from that continuous improvement, it is a way for you to have very credible, insightful data to be able to continue to see year over year how your conservation measures and how some of your operational improvements are having a positive effect on your emissions. So I want to just give me 1 second and we'll start diving into questions. So the first question that we had was asking if the base language for the negative forms, positive forms, the conclusion standardized, or is that Green Circle's way for folks looking for verification? So great question. The requirements, so the language is not standardized, but how you state it is through those ISO standards. And so most verifiers, including Green Circle, will use the ISO language from the framework because that's the easiest way to comply with the framework and make sure that we're all in alignment. So great question. Second question, does Green Circle help calculate scope 1 and 2 emissions in addition to GHG verification? So yes, we can look at, however, the one thing I will tell you guys in terms of looking at calculating those emissions is that data still has to come from you. And so we're still doing the verification on the information that you are providing. So for a specific example, we would be looking at where your facility is located so that we can apply the correct emissions factors to that calculation so that we're incorporating that regional impact on your emissions. And so those are things where the core data and some of those decisions on scope does still have to come from you, but we can kind of work through that to make sure that we're clear on the emissions data and how you want to look at it from your perspective to then proceed to the verification process. And so it kind of helps to have a good understanding of where you're at today and what you're tracking and how you're tracking to know whether you're ready. In some cases, if you're early on in your scope 1 and scope 2 process, you may not even be ready for limited assurance. And so that's something we can help you kind of understand and talk through with you on what's the best, for your business needs. The last question we've got, oh no, I got more coming in. Are the data requirements for GHG verification similar to what people would need to collect for EPDs? So collecting data once is two birds with one stone, or is it an entirely different process since there are different ISO standards? There are a lot of similarities between GHG and EPDs. I am not an expert on EPDs to be able to say how similar they are, Brendan. So that is something that I will have to like go back to my team and get a better understanding of. But there are a lot of similarities between how we're looking at that. Specifically if we're talking about it from an EPD like category perspective. So that one's definitely one I can follow up on and get some more information from the team. Oh yes, great. So I am very excited for this last question, you guys. The GHG protocol is currently reviewing to update scope 2. Yes. Would that affect companies' previous GHG inventories? So great questions, great question. And I didn't go into this in a lot of detail in that last slide. So when the other benefit of doing an annual verification for your emissions is because these frameworks do update routinely. And so there may be new factors and new calculation methodologies. They may change the requirements depending on their, their scheme and what they're trying to do with their standard. And so there's two ways to go about this. If the change, like what GHG protocol is reviewing and trying to really bring up to speed, if that change would materially impact your report, some companies will go back and reissue that report. And so we can make that update to say, hey, now this is in alignment with this version of the ISO standard, which does depend on the GHG protocol. The other benefit though of doing it annually is then, if you did it last year and you're going to do it this year, we can start to incorporate those requirements, those updated requirements into next year. So you might be fine that it doesn't materially impact your current statements. But for future, then, if you do it annually, you're always able to be, up to speed on the, best version, most recent version of the standards that we're using to do that verification. So that's a great question. So it's kind of twofold, where depending on the change, you may have to go back and update at least your current, your most recent GHG. But it also gives us the concept of, you need to do it annually because you want to incorporate those new versions of the standard. How do the assurance levels figure into ability to make claims to customers about carbon neutrality? What else is needed to do that? So I am not a carbon neutrality expert, so I won't be able to answer that question very directly, Michael. But it does, when you're looking at GHG emissions, our verification is very specific to the emissions. And so when you're looking at carbon neutrality, it does depend on the framework, your goal, what you're doing in order to evaluate that neutrality. And so I think limited assurance is a good start for that, but it will depend on what your goal is for carbon neutrality and what methodologies you're using for that. We have 1 minute. So I just wanted to thank everybody for joining. I hope you learned something, and definitely, Green Circle is here to help. And so here's the contact information to stay connected with us. We're always posting. Check out our website. Check out our LinkedIn. We've got some great blogs and some content there. We've got a QR code here if you're interested in talking to any of our team. You have questions or you really want to understand our verification process more. So thank you for joining me, for being super engaged with the polls and having great questions. And I really hope you have a great rest of your week. Thanks all.